I was having dinner with an old friend last week, someone I've known for 20 years. We were talking about his daughter's education, and he was glowing, practically radiant, as he described the new classical academy he'd just enrolled her in. He spoke about Latin, logic, and the great books with the kind of reverence you usually reserve for a religious conversion. He looked for the first time in years truly at peace, like a man who had finally found a safe harbor after a long storm. But then the conversation drifted toward the local city council's latest economic report. I mentioned a simple statistic I'd read about the falling unemployment rate in our zip code. The shift was instantaneous. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by a look of profound clinical suspicion. He didn't offer a counter statistic or a different interpretation. Instead, he slid his phone across the table. It was a video from a private signaled group grainy footage of a shuttered storefront 3 blocks away, overlaid with ominous text about the managed decline. "That's the reality," he said, his voice dropping to a low, detached monotone. "Everything else is just noise designed to keep you compliant."
What struck me wasn't that he disagreed with the data. It was that he had fundamentally opted out of the shared framework that makes data possible. To him, the official report wasn't just wrong. It was a foreign transmission from an enemy state. This wasn't a political debate. It was a clinical observation of a dead relationship. That moment, that sudden evaporation of common ground over something as mundane as a jobs report, made me realize we've moved past mere polarization. We are witnessing the final shattering of the social contract. We are living in the year 2026, where reality itself has been balkanized, and we're all becoming political exiles in our own neighborhoods, huddled in epistemic ghettos of our own making.
Wow, that is an incredibly vivid picture of what's happening.
It was chilling. That experience, that sudden recognition that we no longer just disagree on policy, but on the very tools we use to measure reality. That is the core observation we're diving into today.
Right.
Our mission is clear. We've moved past simple political opposition and into a full-blown societal fracture.
Precisely. And for you, the listener, we are going to try and map the architecture of this profound fracture.
Okay.
This deep dive will systematically analyze the concepts, these epistemic ghettos, and the new forms of social breakdown known as anomie. We'll trace them back to the structural failures that caused them.
Specifically, the institutional betrayal by elite organizations.
Exactly. And then, most critically, we will examine the defensive response.
The parallel structure.
The parallel structures people are quietly and, I would argue, rationally building to preserve objective truth and core values in this new fragmented reality.
Okay, let's unpack this shift, starting with the shattering itself. What happens when the very ground beneath the social contract just collapses?
Right.
We call this the balkanization of reality. It's absolutely vital, I think, as we start, to clarify what we mean when we say we're no longer just talking about political polarization.
Yes, that's a key distinction.
When I hear polarization, I still picture 2 opposing groups arguing, heatedly, but over the same set of unemployment statistics.
But that shared frame of reference is gone. And that's why the current state is defined as a societal fracture.
It's a completely different model.
We don't have one reality with opposing views anymore. We now have multiple mutually exclusive reality models operating simultaneously.
It's like trying to build a bridge with someone who insists that gravity works differently for their side of the river.
That's a perfect analogy. And the cost of this structural collapse, according to the sources we're looking at, is immediate and staggering. It's measured in the paralyzing escalation of social and transactional friction.
What does that friction look like on a daily basis for the average person?
Well, it means that every interaction, whether you're dealing with a business, a school board, or even a neighbor, is laden with latent political risk.
You can't assume the basics.
You can't. Every conversation requires this exhaustive negotiation of first principles. Am I talking to someone who believes the government statistics, or am I talking to someone who believes a grainy private video feed?
Right.
Most complex modern systems cannot afford that kind of friction. They just seize up. They require a baseline level of shared, predictable reality to function efficiently.
And this is where the fragmentation becomes weaponized, right? Often through data itself.
It's a vicious cycle. Each group, or tribe, as the source material calls it, curates its own specific statistical canon public safety metrics, climate data, jobs reports, and filters them to produce these parallel data sets.
So the data, which is supposed to clarify, ends up just justifying preordained conclusions.
And that delivers us directly to the concept you introduced in your opening, the epistemic ghetto.
Let's define that.
The word epistemic refers to knowledge and truth. A ghetto, in this sense, is a highly fortified area. It's mental, it's digital, and it's often reinforced by physical location, where a consensus is fundamentally impossible.
Because you can't even agree on the evidence.
Exactly. It is a space where the shared evidence necessary for debate is explicitly rejected by the other side.
So if you and I can't agree on whether unemployment is rising or falling, then any discussion about tax policy or infrastructure spending is it's meaningless.
We're locked in separate rooms shouting arguments that don't penetrate the fortified walls of the other side's reality.
That's a perfect description. And if we look at the experience of this senior editor in London, Elena, we see this phenomenon playing out professionally.
Yes, she was working at a major media conglomerate, a place historically tasked with building a consensus reality.
But she described feeling like she was living inside an epistemic ghetto that her own newsroom was creating. What was her specific breaking point?
She observed that the newsroom had stopped being a neutral filter and had, in her words, become a tribal amplifier.
A tribal amplifier.
Stories were no longer pursued because they revealed verifiable truth. They were pursued because they served a specific political narrative. Any fact that complicated that narrative was minimized, spun, or simply buried.
So the reality she was reporting on felt entirely manufactured.
Completely disconnected from the observable world outside her office windows.
That moment she realized her professional role was no longer to discover truth, but to amplify a predetermined version of the truth. That had to be a trigger for a massive sense of social instability.
It was. It created a deep, pervasive sense of anomie, the normlessness and social instability we're seeing today. She felt this growing within her because the official version of reality, produced by the very institutions she worked for, was so clearly curated.
And that's a powerful driver for the individual decision to just strategically withdraw.
Exactly.
That feeling of losing your grip on what's real because the institution's meant to tell you the true or failing, that takes us into the formal sociological framework for defining this breakdown. Anomie.
The term anomie, which we generally translate as normlessness, was popularized by the French sociologist Émile Durkheim.
Right, in the late 1800s.
Initially in his 1893 work, The Division of Labor in Society, and later in his foundational study on suicide in 1897. But we need to pause on that simple translation of normlessness.
Why? Didn't he simply mean a lack of social rules?
He was far more nuanced. Durkheim himself avoided the literal word normlessness. He described anomie using much stronger, almost existential terms.
Like what?
Terms like derangement and an insatiable will. He gave it a deeply moral context, specifically calling unfulfilled desire the malady of the infinite.
Malady of the infinite. That's powerful.
The core idea is that desire without limit can never be fulfilled. It only grows more intense and debilitating because society has failed to provide a moral compass that sets reasonable limits.
So it's not just the absence of rules. It's a profound mismatch between what the individual expects or what they're socially conditioned to desire and what society can legitimately provide.
Precisely. Anomie, for Durkheim, arises generally from a mismatch between personal or group standards and wider social standards, or from the sheer lack of a social ethic. This creates a kind of moral deregulation.
And he also said too much rigidity could cause it too, right?
Interestingly, yes, a society with little individual discretion could also produce a form of anomie because the collective structure could not adapt.
Which reminds me of his observations during the Industrial Revolution, which was the original context for the term.
That's right. In the late 19th century, Durkheim was observing the collapse of traditional structures. He used anomie to describe the dissonance between older systems of collective guild labor, what he called mechanical solidarity.
Which was very homogenous. Everyone had similar skills. It was slow to change.
Exactly. Immense inertia. And the new system, driven by industrial specialization, which he called organic solidarity.
The old mechanical system was just too slow and rigid to adapt to the new specialized demands.
It couldn't. The mass regimentation of the mechanical system couldn't adapt quickly to the necessary changes of the market. Anomie resulted from a malfunction of organic solidarity after that transition. He famously argued that if producers and consumers are close and markets are transparent, they can reckon mutual needs and equilibrium is established smoothly.
But an opaque environment gets in the way.
Yes, an opaque environment like vast, unregulated markets was interposed, hiding the true needs and creating moral confusion.
That opaque environment feels awfully familiar today, doesn't it? Just replace unregulated markets with unregulated information flows.
It holds up remarkably well. Durkheim later applied this idea to his studies on suicide, linking anomie not just to economic crises, but also to cultural shifts. He noted the high suicide rates in Protestant communities compared to Catholic ones.
Attributing it to the Protestant emphasis on individualism.
Right. This, he argued, led to a poorly integrated society and slackened social ties where the individual was left adrift.
Then we jump forward a few decades to Robert K. Merton in 1938. He shifts the focus from structural change to the individual response.
And this is central to how we think about deviance today. Merton's work is pivotal because he linked Anomie directly to deviance and criminality, effectively moving the concept into criminology.
His argument was about the gap between goals and means.
Yes, a critical discontinuity between common, shared social goals and the legitimate institutionalized means society provides to attain those goals.
And what was the primary social goal he identified in U.S. society?
Merton argued that the extreme emphasis upon the accumulation of wealth as the primary visible symbol of success, without equally emphasizing the institutionalized means to achieve it, was the central driver of Anomie.
So the goal be wealthy is universally promoted, but the legitimate means, education, hard work, opportunity, aren't universally available.
And that imbalance inflates the emotional and cultural value attached to the goal, which correspondingly reduces the perceived significance of the means.
When people see the legitimate paths are blocked, they innovate.
Merton argued this leads to an increase in fraud, corruption, vice, crime, in short, the entire catalog of prescribed behavior. This is what we now call structural anomie, where deviance is a predictable, albeit undesirable, response to systemic tension.
Like the growth of organized crime during Prohibition.
A perfect example.
We've covered structural anomie, the predictable system failure that breeds deviance. But what we're seeing today in our information age, it feels less predictable. It feels less like a direct response to a blocked path and more like a kind of internal combustion.
That takes us to the modern concept, reflexive anomie.
Okay.
The Durkheim-Merton interpretations are powerful, but they struggle to fully capture the complexity of a modern, nonlinear, hyper-individualized society. The core difference is the shift in focus from macro-level structural failures, the weakening of social connections, to macro-level behavioral change driven by individually significant narratives.
So the decision-making center has migrated from the institution to the individual.
And that individual has become the ultimate authority.
How does that work?
This shift is powered by reflexivity, which is the ability of an actor to use accumulated knowledge, past events, theories, personal observations, to interpret their actions and adjust their decisions.
But the critical element is where the authority for that knowledge rests.
And where does it rest? Increasingly, the validity of knowledge is determined solely by the self-reflection of the subject. The individual is the ultimate authority.
Through an inner dialogue.
Exactly. Modeling future scenarios, clarifying one's own status, analyzing objective factors entirely against personal desires and fears before making a decision.
That sounds like self-sovereignty, which we usually think of as a good thing. But you mentioned this reliance on purely internal authority can lead to false self-reflection.
It absolutely can. The subject may gain invincible confidence in their narrative, but this intense reliance on a purely internal authority does not protect them from profound error or misconception.
So this is reflexive anomie.
Reflexive anomie is subjective and nonlinear, a non-predictable product of self-organization at the micro level. This entire process is stimulated by the hyper-acceleration of modern life. Rapid social and spatial mobility, the catastrophic weakening of small group connections like the family, and an increased, almost total dependence on the self for validation and direction.
To bring this terrifying concept out of the textbook and into real life, sociologists have applied reflexive anomie to try and understand the extreme edge of this phenomenon. Seemingly unwarranted, devastating mass acts.
Yes, the concept provides a framework for analyzing cases that defy traditional sociological explanations. The key examples cited are Anders Breivik's 2011 attack in Norway and the 2017 Las Vegas shooting by Stephen Paddock.
Why those two cases specifically?
Because of their near-total lack of traditional sociological causality.
Walk us through the criteria that define these case studies.
Okay, there were three key shared criteria. First, their actions were devastating, severely undermining the fundamental values of safe, peaceful coexistence. Second, and this is critical, the rigorous investigations into both cases found no confirmed mental disorders that could explain their actions.
So traditional psychiatric deviation was ruled out.
It was. Third, no significant external social determinants were found. We're talking about no poverty, no long-term unemployment, no pressure from an extremist group, and no dire financial circumstances.
So they weren't economically desperate, they weren't coerced, and they weren't pathologically ill. Their motives, therefore, were generated entirely from within.
Precisely. Their motives arose entirely at the micro level within the perpetrator's cognitive structure. Breivik formulated this dense, highly personalized manifesto for a crusade, yet investigators found zero evidence that he was anything other than its sole representative.
And
Paddock famously left no note, and his motive remains entirely unknown. No political, religious, or ideological affiliations were found. Both reached the decision to commit mass murder based purely on internal subjective motivation.
a motivation that was neither justified by common social values nor restrained by any external authority.
They were acting as fully self-authorizing individuals, completely outside the bounds of conventional sociological causality.
That is a genuinely terrifying thought. That the complexity of modern society has made the individual actor so isolated and self-authorizing that their internal narrative alone can generate catastrophic, unpredictable events.
And when you scale that up to millions of people building their own subjective realities, it's no wonder social capital evaporates.
It all leads back to the low-trust environment we discussed.
Yes, when millions of individuals rely on purely subjective, internally validated truths, every interaction becomes a negotiation of reality. This latent political risk stifles spontaneity, it destroys charity, and makes authentic cooperation almost impossible.
Which brings us back to Elena, the editor in London. The low-trust environment created by her own employer drove her out.
Her strategic withdrawal illustrates the first line of defense in the face of this collapse.
What did she do?
She quit the compromised institutional structure and initiated what the sources call the Great Migration of Minds. She joined parallel information networks.
Which are what, exactly?
They're private, high-trust, digital circles of analysts, journalists, and thinkers who just bypass the administrative gatekeepers.
How do they ensure trust in an environment where major news organizations have failed?
They rely on technical, verifiable measures alongside high social trust. This includes peer-to-peer fact-checking, where sourcing is immediately verifiable, and increasingly, technologies like blockchain-verified sources to authenticate original data.
So they're abandoning systems that demand they accept curated narratives.
And instead are explicitly focused on preserving a commitment to empirical reality and verified sourcing among a select group of trusted peers. It's a defensive survival strategy for objectivity.
It's the act of people saying, if the center won't tell me the truth, I will find people I trust who will build that truth with me.
Exactly. This retreat is a reaction against the institutional collapse that is so profound. Many now see elite organizations not as failures, but as active betrayers of their original mandates.
Okay, that's a perfect transition. The story of Elena finding objective truth through private networks. It really underscores a massive failure at the top. This next section is about understanding that betrayal, the elite managerial class, abandoning its role as objective reality filters.
The sources are very clear in identifying the mechanism of corrosion in the public sphere. They describe certain doctrines, often termed woke culture, as functioning like an acidic solvent.
An acidic solvent. That's a strong phrase.
And the goal of this solvent is systematic, the deconstruction of the unifying identity of the citizen.
Now that is a highly charged claim. How does the source material argue this ideological solvent systematically deconstructs the shared identity of citizen?
It argues that it does so by prioritizing what it calls an ever-proliferating matrix of immutable identity markers, race, gender, sexual orientation, etc., over shared civic responsibility, universal laws, or a common national identity.
So when citizenship becomes secondary to one's tribal identity marker,
it accelerates a societal regression toward tribalism. The national community fragments into competing grievance groups engaged in this zero-sum struggle for status and resources.
It sounds like institutionalized tribal hunting, managed by bureaucracy.
Precisely. And the betrayal occurs because the institutions meant to hold the public sphere together, the media, corporate boards, government agencies, have internalized this framework.
They've stopped being neutral filters.
They've abdicated their role and become partisan tribal amplifiers.
And what is the consequence of this institutional abdication?
Total credit bankruptcy. The source material argues that the official pronouncements from these institutions are no longer met with good faith debate, but with immediate tribal attribution.
Right. So when a major organization releases a report, the first question in the public's mind is not, is this factually correct?
It's, Which side is this serving? Is this a propaganda transmission from an enemy state or an internal document from my ally? The credit reserves of the elite institutions are entirely depleted.
For the individual who still believes in a shared civic identity and objective standards, the classically liberal, empirically minded person, this results in a feeling of profound isolation.
They become political exiles in their own country. They find that their language, that language of universal rules, verifiable truths, and reasoned discourse, is now rendered archaic.
Dismissed, or even deemed oppressive by the new orthodoxy controlling the institution.
This isn't just frustration, it's a deep, noble sense of betrayal, the gutting of the very principles of fairness and empirical rigor they were taught to uphold.
And the betrayal is made agonizingly worse by the feeling that the institutional norms are applied selectively.
It creates a sense of profound injustice. When administrative rules, institutional norms, and even the law are applied differently based on the identity or ideology of the person involved, the social contract is voided.
We surrender some autonomy in exchange for predictable equal protection.
And when that predictability vanishes, for those who believe in the rule of law, it feels like a civil Cold War waged by bureaucratic means.
If the media failed as a reality filter, then the universities failed as the transmission belt for cultural heritage and objective knowledge. The crisis in higher education is arguably the most severe institutional betrayal.
It is the ultimate act of self-sabotage. Universities were historically the temples of knowledge, tasked with the free, rational pursuit of truth. The contemporary crisis, according to the source material, is that they have abandoned the transmission of a common cultural heritage in favor of ideological indoctrination.
And this collapse is what triggers the rational defensive response we see in the rise of classical academies and homeschooling. It's an act of educational self-defense.
Exactly. We see this demonstrated perfectly in the experience of a history professor. Let's call him Dr. Julian Vance. He spent 3 decades at a prestigious Midwestern university. His entire professional life was predicated on the sacred vow of meritocracy.
The best idea wins. The strongest evidence prevails.
Exactly.
What finally convinced him that staying and fighting was useless?
He witnessed a corrosive systemic shift, not just in the classroom, but in the administration. Admissions and tenure committees began prioritizing what he termed immutable identity markers over the strength of a candidate's intellectual rigor or scholarly record.
The system stopped rewarding excellence as defined by universal standards.
Right.
Was there a specific event that crystallized this feeling of betrayal for him?
Yes. The final straw was the suppression of a young colleague's research paper on global economic history. The research was impeccable, empirically solid, widely praised by outside reviewers, but the conclusions of the paper, based on the data, were seen as inconvenient. They did not align with the university's current, very specific ideological sensitivity mandates regarding grievance and structural inequality.
So the institution was actively choosing ideological compliance over verifiable truth.
That's how he saw it. Dr. Vance realized the social contract was dissolved. The institution was no longer a place that rewarded the best and brightest based on their work. It had become an engine of political compliance.
So she left.
His response was not a fiery public protest, but a quiet, defensive withdrawal. He walked away from his tenured position and joined a small, fledgling private institution, a parallel academy.
And that parallel academy, by contrast, operates on what principle?
It operates on pure, unadulterated merit. They don't filter based on background or ideology. They only ask, can you prove your thesis? Can you support your argument with rigorous, verifiable data?
So the sources see this rise of private alternatives not as anti-intellectualism,
but as a critical defensive survival strategy to keep the flame of objective merit alive while the official temples of knowledge have become, as the sources claim, temples of orthodoxy.
And the mechanism for this ideological capture isn't subtle. It's baked directly into the hiring process using tools like diversity statements.
The source material explicitly frames the use of ideological filters and diversity statements in faculty hiring as a corruption of academic practice. The critics argue these statements function essentially as loyalty oaths to the left.
And they claim these practices have virtually eliminated conservative scholars from the prestige institutions, ensuring ideological conformity.
Rather than intellectual diversity.
We don't have to rely solely on anecdotes for this. We have concrete data from extensive national surveys of faculty that confirm this profound climate of fear on campus. The numbers are genuinely shocking.
They paint a picture of a suffocating environment where a significant minority of academics are genuinely frightened of professional reprisal. Overall, nearly 1 in 4 faculty members, 23%, report worrying about losing their jobs because someone misunderstands something they have said or done.
1 in 4. That's a staggering level of anxiety within the very place meant to promote free inquiry.
And that fear isn't just about losing a job, it's about being professionally ostracized. An additional 40% of faculty report worrying about damaging their reputation.
When you combine those figures, you have a system running on fear, where the incentive is to stay silent, not to speak uncomfortable truths.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Comparing today's climate to historical low points for academic freedom.
Like the McCarthy era.
Exactly. The level of self-censorship today is dramatically higher. During the height of the Cold War, a similar survey asked social scientists if they had toned down their writing for fear of controversy. Only 9% said yes.
And today?
Today, 35% of faculty overall say they have recently toned down their writing for fear of controversy.
That means 1 in 3 faculty members are editing or softening their published work right now because of fear.
Compared to fewer than 1 in 10 during the McCarthy era, it's a massive increase in self-imposed intellectual restriction.
And that restriction is pervasive across all professional contexts. It's not just in scholarly articles.
No. For instance, 56% report self-censoring online or on social media. 42% say they are likely to self-censor during classroom lectures or discussions.
Think about that. Almost half of the people teaching your children are holding back key information or viewpoints because they are afraid of the consequences.
And the fear extends to everyday interaction. Roughly 27% to 28% of faculty frequently self-censor in conversations with administrators, with other faculty, and even with their own students.
And just to be clear, this isn't about being polite.
No. The definition faculty are working with here is refraining from sharing views due to fear of social, professional, legal, or even violent consequences.
Yeah.
This is about professional survival.
We even see the severity of the consequences in real-world disciplinary actions, even for discussing foundational facts.
The case is Professor Johnson Varkey, a biology professor who was allegedly fired for simply explaining chromosomal sex determination, a core biological fact, in his human anatomy and physiology class, is illustrative.
What happened?
4 students walked out, the college investigated him for an ethics violation, and terminated his contract. Now, he was later reinstated, but the message that institutional targeting sends is clear. The incentive structure now punishes speaking openly about politically sensitive facts, even if those facts are verifiable science.
The data also reveals that this fear is not shared equally. This atmosphere of hostility disproportionately targets one specific ideological group.
That is abundantly clear. Conservative faculty are the most fearful demographic. A staggering 55% of conservative faculty report that they at least occasionally hide their political views in an attempt to keep their jobs.
55%. And for moderates and liberals.
That figure drops sharply to 35% for moderates and only 17% for liberal faculty. Conservatives are 3 times more likely than liberals to conceal their political beliefs to maintain their livelihood.
And this fear of expressing views seems entirely rational when you look at hiring perceptions.
The bias in perception is institutional. When asked about fit within their departments, nearly 3/4, 71% of faculty said a liberal individual would be a very or somewhat positive fit.
But for a conservative individual?
Only 20% said the same. That disparity means a conservative is overwhelmingly more likely to be perceived as a poor fit in their department, which, in the zero-sum game of academic hiring, effectively translates to do not hire.
Historically, tenure was supposed to be the great shield against this kind of ideological pressure. Does the data suggest tenure still protects academics?
Not reliably. While non-tenured faculty are statistically more likely to self-censor,
32% of non-tenured faculty censor their publications versus 23% of tenured.
right. But the fact that tenured professors are self-censoring at all suggests they lack faith in the guarantee of tenure. They fear that if they offend the wrong person or the prevailing orthodoxy, the university will simply fail to honor its own protections.
The stakes are so high that, as one tenured professor noted, I feel pressure to conceal certain opinions. The atmosphere in certain academic units can be cult-like and fascistic.
And the topics driving this fear reflect the core fracture in society. When faculty are asked to name the issues that are most difficult to discuss openly and honestly on campus, the answers are a direct mirror of our societal conflict.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is number one.
Overwhelmingly, 70% of faculty report difficulty. On highly visible campuses, that figure approached 90%.
What other topics are creating this chilling effect?
Other sensitive issues where a supermajority of faculty report difficulty include racial inequality, 51%, transgender rights, 49%, and affirmative action, 47%. These are the topics where the ideological solvent is most active.
And where the institutional tolerance for divergent views is lowest.
Exactly.
Finally, we need to return to the core mechanism of ideological enforcement. Mandatory DEI statements. How do faculty view these tools?
The debate over diversity, equity, and inclusion statements is highly polarizing. Overall, roughly half of the faculty polled believe requiring candidates to submit these statements is never or rarely justifiable for hiring, and about the same for promotion.
But the ideological breakdown reveals the true depth of the fracture within the academy.
It does. Nearly all conservative faculty and the vast majority of moderate faculty oppose mandatory DEI statements. Liberal faculty are mixed, but even among liberals, a significant third still say these mandates are never or rarely justifiable.
Critics argue these statements function as an ideological litmus test.
As one professor explained, to not submit a DEI statement, even if technically voluntary, is tantamount to admitting that you don't believe in the goals, making them functionally required for career advancement.
Despite this climate of fear, 45% of faculty still report having confidence in U.S. colleges, suggesting a desire for reform rather than total abandonment. What is the consensus solution faculty themselves point toward?
A supermajority agrees on the necessary starting point: institutional neutrality. 66% of faculty believe colleges and universities should not take official positions on political and social issues.
And 70% believe official faculty units should also remain neutral.
This stance, of course, is rooted in the philosophy articulated in the University of Chicago's famous Calvin Report.
Right, which says the university is the home and sponsor of critics. It is not itself the critic.
Exactly. By maintaining neutrality, a university avoids establishing an orthodoxy that chills speech. It remains a neutral arena for debate, optimizing the knowledge-generating process by welcoming the fullest range of views.
As one faculty member commented, "It is not mine or the university's role to indoctrinate or influence. We are simply here to share knowledge so that the receiver can use that knowledge how they want to use it."
A beautiful summary of the ideal.
Yet the reality is often the opposite, where nonconformity, even in the form of intellectual parity, is aggressively punished.
And this illustrates why faith in reform is waning. Look at the case of computer science professor Stuart Regis. His university encouraged faculty to include a land acknowledgement statement on their syllabus,
Signaling their political alignment.
Exactly. Regis, an intellectual contrarian, chose instead to write a parity statement, arguing that by the labor theory of property, the local indigenous people can claim historical ownership of almost none of the land.
That's a direct, if provocative, intellectual challenge to the institutional orthodoxy. How did the university handle that?
The response was bureaucratic warfare. The university removed his syllabus, encouraged students to file complaints against him, and even went so far as to siphon his students away to a newly created parallel section of the same class taught by another professor.
They launched a year-long investigation into him.
They did. This case demonstrates the high professional risk of nonconformity and provides clear evidence of the differential application of institutional norms.
The breakdown in trust is complete. The systems designed to protect the pursuit of truth are the systems that have betrayed that mission.
So if you are an empirically minded individual, you recognize the fight to hold the center is lost, at least for now.
Which means the logical, functionalist response is a strategic retreat. We are seeing a movement toward building genuine defensive structures. And that brings us to the crucial concept of the parallel polis.
The parallel polis is a potent sociopolitical concept originating not from modern sociology, but from the experience of totalitarianism
In Czechoslovakia under Soviet control.
It was articulated by the Czech political thinker and dissident Václav Benda in connection with the Charter 77 civic initiative. Benda described the people involved as a remnant, those who refused to submit to the cognitive totalitarianism of the communist state.
It's fascinating how Benda framed the totalitarian threat. It wasn't just physical oppression. It was psychological warfare designed to shred the existing social fabric.
Benda saw that communist regimes tried to achieve perfect integration through perfect fragmentation.
Meaning what?
The goal was to systematically destroy all natural intermediate social bonds, the church, the local clubs, the community associations, in order to impose a centralized fictional unity commanded by the party.
And the parallel polis was the defensive answer.
fostering the rediscovery of meaningful social life by developing parallel social structures dedicated to authentic values.
So the goal wasn't a revolution or a direct political confrontation. It was about building a complete independent society based on its own values.
It was a deeply moral, existential choice, driven by the desire to preserve cognitive sovereignty. A powerful example is the Benda family's refusal to put up the Soviet flag outside their apartment building to commemorate the communist takeover anniversary.
They knew this was a calculated risk that could lead to punishment.
Absolutely, but it was about prioritizing the ability to distinguish between truth and lies.
Benda's wife, Camila, noted that the most dangerous thing is when a child learns to lie automatically without even realizing he's telling a lie.
The refusal to participate in the lie, the act of moral agency, was the foundational, non-negotiable principle of the parallel polis. It was a refusal to have their internal reality corrupted by the external state.
We are seeing this exact strategic withdrawal or civilizational defense happening today, most notably in education, where parents feel the public system is indoctrinating, not educating.
The surge in homeschooling and the rise of private classical academies are not random trends. They are rational, defensive responses to the institutional betrayal we just detailed. It's an act of educational exile.
Where parents recognize that the cost of participation in the administrative state's educational system is the corruption of their children's values.
And their perception of reality.
This takes us to the experience of Marcus and Sarah in the Pacific Northwest.
Marcus and Sarah were exactly the type of successful, highly engaged parents who typically work within the public school system. They didn't withdraw because the schools lacked funding or resources.
But due to what they perceived as ideological capture.
They realized the curriculum was systematically replacing classical civilizational values. The core intellectual fire of Western thought based on reason, logic, and a universal human experience with identity-based grievance narratives.
And what was the immediate consequence for their family?
Marcus described realizing his children were being trained to live in a balkanized social reality. They were taught to view their neighbors, their history, and their own place in society tribally, rather than as shared citizens.
So rather than engage in a losing battle with a vast state apparatus,
they chose to build their own alternative.
They created their own defensive architecture, a homeschooling polis.
That's precisely what they did. They joined a high-trust local co-op that now functions as a micro-society. This parallel polis operates entirely outside the administrative state's reach, focusing intensely on the great books, logic, history, and classical education.
It is an intentional defensive construction of a safe harbor.
Designed to preserve cognitive sovereignty and safeguard the values they believe are foundational for the next generation. It is not an act of abandoning intellectual rigor. It is an act of intellectual preservation.
Benda's original vision laid out several core pillars for the parallel polis that extend beyond education.
Yes, the original Benda pillars were parallel education and science, an underground culture, an independent information system, political structures, and crucially, a parallel economy.
Why was the economy so important?
Benda recognized that the totalitarian state strictly regulates the economy because it is a critical resource for arbitrary control of citizens. The economy of dissent, conversely, had to be based on reciprocity and trust, seeking resources not dependent on central control.
In our modern low-trust environment, what does this economic retreat look like?
We are seeing a modern economic shift toward high-trust, small-scale networks where shared values are a prerequisite for business. This involves explicit contractualism replacing handshake deals, as you can no longer assume universal good faith.
You see the growth of private security.
Where public trust in law enforcement has evaporated, you also see local trade networks prioritizing reliability and ideological alignment over state efficiency or scale.
The consequence is a move toward a neo-medieval patchwork of trusted enclaves.
A direct rational adaptation to the disintegration of universal social capital.
And this concept has been literally revived in the digital and physical spaces by thinkers involved in crypto-anarchism.
The revival is remarkably concrete. Scholars and activists are applying Benda's principles to the internet, arguing that it facilitates truly parallel institutions. This intellectual movement culminated in the establishment of the physical space in Prague, the Institute of Crypto-Anarchy, in 2014.
And this venue operates explicitly as a think tank focused on innovation without central authority.
Aiming to build voluntary parallel structures for the digital age.
And they enforce a strict commitment to remaining state-free, even in their financial operations.
Absolutely. The Institute's commitment to self-sovereignty is reflected in its policy of accepting only cryptocurrency payments. This became a form of political activism, like boycotting the Czech government's electronic record of sales mandate.
It illustrates the core ethos.
Finding resources and systems of exchange that are completely autonomous and outside the control of the central government's monetary tools. The economic pillar of the parallel polis today is built on decentralized finance and self-sovereign systems.
If all the larger institutions, the media, the university, the government, have failed or become hostile, then the responsibility for preserving truth and values defaults to the smallest, most resilient unit of society, the family.
Benda recognized the central importance of the traditional family, which the totalitarian state sought systematically to destroy precisely because it was the last bastion of independent moral authority.
He called it the essential microsphere of resilience.
And he defined its profound civilizational gifts.
What were these foundational gifts of family fellowship, according to Benda?
Well, he identified three. The first is the fruitful fellowship of love. In the family, individuals are bound together not on the basis of merit or productivity or legal rights, but by mutual need and affectionate reciprocation.
It's an unconditional bond.
It stands in radical defiance of the cold, transactional nature of the outside world, which constantly demands calculation and performance.
It's a space where you are valued simply for existing, not for what you produce.
Precisely. The second gift is freedom. Benda argued this freedom is given so absolutely that it enables permanent, eternal decisions.
How so?
Every promise of fidelity kept, every marriage vow honored in defiance of adversity is a radical defiance of finitude. These acts of commitment elevate the participants and demonstrate a freedom that no state can grant or take away.
And the final gift focuses on the irreplaceable role of the individual.
The third gift is the dignity and unique role of the individual. In nearly every other social role, as an employee, a citizen, a member of an association, we are fundamentally replaceable. But within the family, the unique combination of parent, spouse, or child makes the individual irreplaceable.
The law of love governs, not the cold calculation of justice.
Benda believed this provided a profound, unique role for the individual that defies utility.
This means that the core strategy for surviving this societal winter is not a mass political movement aimed at seizing the center. It is consolidation and preservation within these small, protective microspheres.
The focus of the Watchman today is the fortified, truth-seeking family, the intentional local community, and the economically autonomous household. These microspheres are the defensive architecture of sanity being built in response to institutional betrayal and the collapse of a shared reality.
So what we have distilled from this deep dive is a clear, cold diagnosis. The societal fracture is complete. The total collapse of institutional trust, fueled by the weaponization of identity markers, has driven a rational strategic retreat. Society is transforming from a shared public square into a series of defensive, high-trust parallel structures, the epistemic ghettos and the parallel polis.
The central lesson here is that we must discard the progressive teleology, that unexamined faith that history naturally marches toward greater unity and understanding. We must accept the possibility of a protracted low-trust cycle, a civilizational winter where factionalism and institutional weakness persist indefinitely.
So the fantasy of reforming the compromise center or reconciling opponents within a system that is proven fundamentally broken.
That has to be abandoned, at least for the moment. The task shifts entirely from grand societal salvation to consolidation and preservation.
Exactly. In a world where institutions demand we deny the evidence of our own senses, the most radical and necessary act is to insist, quietly and steadfastly, on objective truth and empirical reality.
This persistence, the act of the watchman in the dark, is not aimed at achieving immediate victory or reforming a broken institution. It is the crucial act on preserving the fundamental metadata, the operating system of objective reality and verifiable truth, without which no future, more humane social order can ever be rebooted. This is the discipline of keeping the flame lit for the chronology on the other side of this winter.